Okay. Hi everyone. Today is a tutorial on special effects in Blender, and I'm going to show you how to do most of this stuff.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere.
And that's all I got, because this takes actually a very long time. So as you can see, it's just this classroom with 3D elements added. So this is a multi-part process. I'm going to get through as many as I can in this tutorial. So first, you have to get the footage, obviously, and this is really difficult. You need to make it so it doesn't bounce up and down much, so you have something that stays in the same spot on your screen at all times, so you can stabilize based on that spot. And okay, so this is after it's stabilized. You can see it's no longer bouncing around all over the place, but it is still kind of blurred around the edges. And then this is with the 3D elements composited on. So yeah, let's just take a look at that opening footage again. This is actually really bad footage. I mean, it's 1080p, but look at how jerky it is and how blurry it is. It's not even focused for half the video, and it makes tracking a real pain. In fact, most of the time it makes it impossible. So yeah, getting good footage is probably the hardest step. It took me a lot of tries, as you can see here. So yeah. Okay, so first step is stabilization. I tried tracking scenes without stabilizing the footage first, and after a few dozen tries I realized it's impossible. At least with Blender anyways. With other, professional 3D tracking software, that's not the case. So first, you open up Blender, you have to make sure it's version 2.65, aka the newest version. This is something that's brand new. So you want to go to the movie clip editor, and you want to go open and find your file. Wherever I put it. Yeah. Okay, and it'll load the footage, and you can just move around by holding the middle mouse button, scroll to zoom. So Blender cannot actually play back footage in real time. That's something that's kind of a pain. If you hold Alt-A, it'll play, but if you zoom in, it'll start like dropping frames and stuff. Well, not here, I guess, but usually. So to make this a little bit better, you want to hold Control Alt U to bring up the user preferences, or you can just go to File, User Preferences. Anyways, you want to go to System and crank up the memory cache as high as you feel comfortable doing so. About half of the memory on my computer is as far as I can go without it becoming totally unstable. So for this, what we want to do is we want to make sure that there's one point that stays dead center, or not dead center, but it stays in the same spot on the screen. And then we're going to try and keep it in that same spot, and that'll stabilize the footage. So first of all, we have to find the start of the footage, where it stops shaking around. Okay, about frame 85, let's say. So go down here to Start and type in 85. Find where your footage ends. Okay, probably about there is as good as it's going to get. So frame 324. Okay, great. Now, when you're on the timeline here, you can press Shift and left to go back to the start, or right to go to the end. Okay, so now that we're at the start, we want to make sure that we're in tracking, not reconstruction or anything like that. We want to go to tracking settings, and we want to go to blurry footage, because it'll choose the best presets for us. And we want to change this from location tracking, not location, rotation, or even scaling, but all three of them: location, rotation, and scaling. And this will give our points the best chance of actually staying tracked. And you don't want to mess with the frames limit. That'll just cut off your track at an arbitrary position. But you want to set the margin to about the same size as your pattern size. The pattern size is the square here, and the margin will keep that square from going off the screen. When the margin comes within the bounds of the screen, it'll just destroy that point, which is a lot better than the point going all crazy. So I should explain a little bit of what's going on here. You can hold Control and click to place points. It will place them with the preset settings here of a box size 31 and a search size 91. And what this means is that each frame, it will check within that search size of 91 and try and find a box that matches the previous frame. So let's just place a couple of points here and I'll demonstrate. So if I press A, it'll select all the points. Something to note is that you have to get the settings right when you are placing the points. You cannot change the settings for all the points at once afterwards. It's kind of a pain. And then you just go down here to track and press forward. And since the markers are so big, it'll take longer. If we were just using the default little tiny markers, it would track a lot quicker, but it'll lose some markers almost immediately. By that, I mean that they'll stop tracking and become useless. So as you can see, they're leaving little red trails here, and that's good. That means that it's actually, tracking the footage, and we can use that. So for this, what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to track a single point or a few points to stabilize our footage. So I'll go back to start, and the monitor stays pretty much dead center this whole time. So I'll just place a few points on the monitor. That looks good. And then press A and track that. And I find that if you zoom out, it goes marginally faster because it's not actually, rendering the frame every time as much because it's a lot smaller. So as you can see, it's leaving paths. It's successfully tracking. Now this would take, I don't know, about 20 minutes. So I'm just going to show you what the result would be. So if I go down here to 3, I think it is. Great. Okay, so now I only tracked one marker here. That's kind of bad because you want several markers so you can average between all of them. So if one marker is jerking around, the entire screen is not jerking around. So to actually use this, I'll just set everything back to normal. Pretend we're still in tracking. Okay, so we've got our marker. The blue line is where it's going. The red line is where it's been. And that's how you can tell you've got a successful track going on. Okay, so go back to the start. Now we want to go down here to tracking and go to reconstruction. And then then we want to go over to the right here. If this menu is not visible, you can just pull it out with the little tabs on the side. And then you want to select your point or points and press plus, and now the points will be added to the 2D stabilization thing here. You want to make sure it's actually selected, and you want to make sure that this is click stable, or else nothing will happen. See, it's our default footage. Now it's stabilized footage. And you also want to make sure that the point is not locked, which you can tell if it is because there will be something up here. You can turn that off by pressing L. So you want to make sure that auto scale is turned on, or else you'll get these black lines around the edges here, because it is actually moving the screen around. And you're going to lose a fair bit of resolution doing this, but it'll be worth it when you can actually, get some decent tracking. Turn the filter to bilinear so it looks better. Nearest will give you really jagged lines. Bilinear gives you really smooth lines. Stabilized rotation, you can do that if you have multiple points. I usually do not because it kind of makes the edges all jerky as it tries to rotate to counteract it. Okay, so now that we have all this set, we would press Control and left, and then we'd go to our node screen. So by default, there's not going to be really anything here. So okay, so press Use Nodes, add a output node, composite, and this will be what actually gets rendered. Then we can add another one. It's not necessary, but if you're curious of what's going on, you can add a viewer. Now we're going to hook these up to an input. So you want to go add input, and not movie, but you actually want to go to image, even though it's a movie file, kind of weird. Hook that up to our rendering and viewer. And then you have to actually go back and find your raw footage again. Okay. And now, as you can see in the composite node here, if I turn on backdrop, actually, we can see what's in the viewer. And composite is what will be rendered again. It'll show up down here when we're actually rendering. So now we want to actually stabilize it. Oh, first we want to make sure that frames in image is set to our maximum frame number. If you keep it set at 1, you'll come back in 2 hours to find that you've got 364 copies of frame number 1. So you want to go to Distort and get Stabilize 2D and put it into this path here, and it'll just automatically hook up with the nodes. Come on. That's, totally unnecessary, so I'll just delete that. And then you want to load the same file here. and you want to make sure that it is actually the same file. If you see two options here, you want to make sure that it's set to the same option here and on your option over here, or else it won't stabilize anything. Okay, and that's really all there is to it, to stabilizing the footage. You just have to make sure that you've got decent render presets. Usually this will be set to 50% of your starting size. If you want to keep full 1080p, you want to put it to 100%. It'll normally go to C/temp, and that will be cleared on a regular basis. So make sure you grab your final frames. I think that's pretty well it. So I'll just go ahead and render those up. So if I were to go to animation here, we should start seeing renders appear down here. And for every frame, you'll just offset it and resize it and maybe rotate it depending on what you have set and save it to the temp folder. So if I were to go to computer, well, you know how to find C-temp. You'll find a whole bunch of PNGs saving down there, assuming that PNG is what you've got set. It's what I use. Okay, now that we have our stabilized footage, you're probably going to want to, go back and watch this on YouTube later, because there's no chance you'll remember this. Okay. Stabilized footage. So to load your footage, it's just the same process. You go and find your stabilized footage. I have mine right here. So I'll just click one frame, and it'll fill in all the frames. Great. And as you can see, it's a lot smoother this time around. It's kind of blurry around the edges because of all the jerking around. So that's important. When you're walking, I use my cell phone to do this, and if you're using your plain cell phone, it's nearly impossible to get good footage, because every step you take, you will jerk the camera and you'll lose most of your trackers. The whole point of doing 3D tracking is you have to walk to the side or front to back to actually give it some parallax, so it can see things in the foreground moving separate of the background, and then it can track that. If you only look around, it won't be able to get any 3D footage. You can still track, but it'll be 2D. And you also want to make sure that when you're doing the parallax thing, you keep something centered at all times. So if you don't actually have, a targeter on your cell phone, I used a piece of tape in the center of my cell phone. It worked pretty decently. Okay, so we got our stabilized footage. Now we're going to try and make it 3D. And this is what I mean by horrible footage. If you're actually using like a decent camera, it would not lose focus like this all the time. But anyways, tracking settings, you want to make sure you get the good settings. Again, blurry footage, low corrupt scale, set a decent margin, previous frame, all set. Okay, control click on a bunch of high contrast places, and that will place our markers. You can see what the marker sees over here. You want to make sure that it's going to be identifiable and not change too much from frame to frame. So for example, like right here, we've got a lot of contrast, but if the camera jerks up and down at all, then the blackboard will move up and down, the thing in the foreground will not, and Blender will try and track a point that does not actually exist in 3D space. So you want to avoid things like that where the backgrounds can screw it up. It's best to track surface features rather than edge features. But in this case, we don't have many options. So you want to get as many points as you can. You're going to need 8 of them to stick around from start to finish. Oh, and something that's important. Before you start this, you should always put yourself at the start of the footage. I forgot to, so I would wind up losing about 20 frames here. Unless I went back and tracked it backwards, which you can do, but it's annoying. Okay, so let's just pretend I've placed, about 100 points. Great. Okay, so you press A and you start tracking forward, and it's going to track all these points as far as it can. When it loses a point, it'll become pink and it'll no longer have a trail. So you'll come back to this in about 2 hours and you'll be at the last frame. It's a good idea at the last frame. Okay, that was weird. It's a good idea at the last frame to place a whole bunch of new points on things that have come into the frame, and then track it backwards, which you can do by just pressing the left arrow instead of the right arrow. Pretty simple. And then you can also, well, I'll show you in the next step. So kill this tracking. So let's pretend that I've let this track both ways, front and back. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean up the tracks, because though most of your tracks will be decent, you're going to wind up with a number of tracks that are just kind of all over the place, and that will confuse Blender. All Blender can see is the tracks. It can actually see the raw footage you give it. So you want to make sure the tracks are as good as possible. Okay, so here is a fully tracked scene, just kind of fresh out of the oven, no cleaning up yet. So you can see there's pink markers all over the scene. Those are tracks that have fallen by the wayside. They'll still be useful. They'll still exist in 3D space as long as... how do I explain this? They don't actually disappear when you're working in 3D space, but they won't add to the accuracy of Blender's tracking, if you understand that. So anyways, from our footage you can see most of these are good. Most of them stay where they're supposed to. A few of them, like this guy, just kind of go insane and start dancing all over the place, and this would make Blender very, very confused. So you want to find where it loses its track in the footage and then delete the rest of the track. So let's see. It looks like it loses it pretty early. So fine. Okay. And we're going to go to clear after, and it'll make the blue line disappear there. So just in case you missed it, clear after. You can also clear before, and that'll delete everything before if you started a new point. So you want to do this for all the points that are just kind of all over the place. If you don't, it'll make it a lot harder for Blender. Okay, so let's pretend that we did that, and we're going to try and solve it. Actually, I'll just show you what happens if you try and solve it as is. So to solve, you need to go down here to camera. Under solve, it'll be camera motion. So you need to set the keyframes. The first keyframe to your starting frame, and the second keyframe to your ending frame. You need to make sure that you have at least 8 trackers survive between these 2 frames. Okay, pretty simple. Oh, it's frozen. Okay. Now, you have to actually make sure that you set the camera's data on the right side here to be actually accurate to what your camera is. So it'll take some Googling. The most important thing is the focal point here. Not so important. Mine says 16 millimeters. It actually, when Blender corrects for itself, it usually comes closer to 9 millimeters. You can tell Blender to correct by going to Refine, Focal Length, Optical Center, K1, K2. The sensor width, very important. You'll get nothing without setting this. So for mine, the Galaxy S3 camera, it's 1 divided by 3.2 inches. If you punch that into Wolfram, you get I think it's 7.93, 1 second. Something like that. And so we've got our sensor width and focal length set, even if it is approximate. Great. Okay, now we're going to want to try and create a camera motion solution. So you just click solve. You don't really have to do any other preparation like setting it to the start. You'll see in the top it's processing. It'll usually get to like 67% or 99% and then freeze up for about 5 minutes or half an hour if you got a really bad track. So down here, when it finally finishes, it's going to give us a number, and that number will be the amount of error it's come across. You want below 3 error. If you get above 3 error, you're going to have pretty much an unusable track. It's probably actually completely misread the camera direction. I think the camera error I came across on this scene was about 3.01 or something, so really pushing it. If you get below 1, it's pretty much perfect. You can place things with extreme accuracy in the 3D world, and it'll stick with your footage really well. Alright, so still not done solving yet, refining solution. I'll just jump ahead to where the solution is actually refined. Good solve. Okay. Okay, so once we have a decent camera solution, the solve error here was actually 3.2, and I used this, and it was difficult to track things, especially on the desk. It was sliding all over the place. So you want to pull out a new screen. You can do that by grabbing onto this and just pulling it out to the left, and that'll create a new tab. And then on the new tab, you set it to 3D view, and you're going to have your camera here. And you want to go to the Constraints tab over here, Object Constraints, add constraint to the camera, Camera Solver, and your camera will suddenly have a whole bunch of 3D dots in front of it, and it will move around. So this is actually pretty good. Well, I mean, it's not great, but it's usable. So these 3D dots obviously represent the dots that we placed here. You can view what the camera is viewing by selecting the camera, pressing Control 0 on the numpad. That looks good. And then to actually make your background appear in the camera frame, you can go to the clip and set as background. Oh, my clip is missing because I changed the file directory. If you lose your files, you can go to External Data, find missing files, find your files, and PNG. Great, okay. Found the missing files. So now as you can see, we have we have video footage in the background, and we have 3D objects in the foreground. You can see the cube is actually over top of the 3D footage. My computer is really struggling here because it's recording at the same time. Okay, so now we are going to go over here and click Set Up Tracking Scene. So it looks like all it did was spawn a plane. In actuality, it did a whole lot more. If we press Control left and go over to the node screen, it set up this whole complex rendering thing for us. So what this does is it basically created two really simple layers for us to use. We've got the layers are down here, just FYI. Currently we have both layers selected. Now we have one or the other. So this object is in the foreground layer. It will actually render like normal. This object is in the background layer. It will not render like normal. Instead, it will render shadows, and it'll render lights, and it will obstruct everything behind it. So you can use it to represent real-world items in your footage. So let's just line our camera up a little bit. You can just select your camera, rotate, press R, X to rotate along the X-axis, maybe Y-axis, or maybe just free rotate. Yeah, that works better. S to scale, rotate, bring it down to line up with our plane a bit more. There's functions to do this automatically if you go to tracking reconstruction, but this scene right here is terrible for that because it really doesn't have any flat planes. You can set either a floor or a wall. To do so, you would click 3 points, shift, right click the points, and then click wall, and that would line it up. I'm not going to do it because it's not going to line up anything. It's just going to be awful. Okay, great. So now we have our camera tracking when I move along the animation bar. If I go to my camera, I can actually see that these 3D objects are overlaid over top of the footage. And if I took some time and lined them up, it would look pretty cool. So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so the first thing I did when I got this was I threw in a bunch of planes and cubes just to represent things I was hoping to work with later. So I've got like one just thrown onto the chalkboard there, one on the desk. It can make it easier if you press Z to make this wireframe, or Z to bring it back. If you hold the middle mouse button and rotate, it'll break away from your camera, and then you can see that these objects I've placed kind of line up with the 3D points. So that's how you relate real-life footage to the 3D world. Okay, great. And then you just go ahead and skip, I don't know, like 36 steps there, and you would have your finished scene. You can see it's got smoke in the foreground, frozen smoke, and a big catastrophe happening in the background. So I'll show you how to set up the catastrophe first. Okay, so to do this, okay, so I'm going to go to a scene that has, okay, so this is a scene that I set up earlier, and this is actually the earlier step in the ceiling collapse video that you saw. So as you can see, this is actually set on the background layer, whereas most of the other stuff in the scene is set in the foreground layer. And that would make it so that this obstructs everything behind it. So now behind the scenes, I'm going to set up a whole bunch of stuff to fracture. So to do that, first of all, I lined up a path just by spawning circles. To spawn circles, you can go Shift A, Mesh, Circle, S to scale, bring it up, and put it just in the path. You want to set your view to orthographic. You can do this by pressing 5 on the numpad, and then you just want to line it up with other stuff in your scene. And you do this 5 times, and you have a path for the meteorite to fly through. Oh, that's not good. Oh, it's cooling off. This doesn't normally happen, right? Oh, it does? Oh. So back to the tutorial. So what I did here, I'll just redo it really quick. So you want to spawn a cube, put it so it lines up with your circles. I'll just delete these existing ones. Yes, delete. Okay, we're going to flatten that out so it looks like a ceiling or a floor. I used 2 different sized rectangles to do this. One for the ceiling and, oops, one for the floor. You can scale along a single axis by pressing S and then pressing like Z to scale along the Z axis or X along the X axis, etc. Great, that looks like a good floor. Line it up. This is why orthographic view is really a good idea. Be really difficult to do in perspective, or more difficult rather. Okay, I'm just going to do a single layer because we're kind of running out of time here. So we got our circle, we got our floor. Now we need something to make it shatter. So I'm going to go to Control Alt U to bring up the user preferences. I'm going to go to Add-ons. Blender actually has a whole bunch of functionality here that's turned off by default for some reason. Maybe that's so it doesn't take an hour to open up like 3 Studio Max does. So you want to go to Object, Self-Fracture. You do not want to go to Fracture Tools. You want to checkmark this and, I don't know, save as default. Great. Okay, so now if we have our object selected and we press spacebar and type in spacebar, fracture, self-fracture. Great. It brings up our self-fracture menu. So let's just say own vertices because it doesn't have any particles. So the first frame here is how it breaks apart. So you can throw in a particle system there, or you can throw in a child object, which is what we're going to do here. I'm just going to demonstrate what it does with its own vertices to start with. So I'm going to throw in some noise, and it's just going to try and crack itself along all of its edges. So you can see in the background, it just fractured itself. Now, it looks like nothing's changed, but if I go to this new layer that just was created, these are old, but this is new. And as you can see, it tried to fracture the material. Looks okay, but we can do a lot better than that. For instance, we actually want to crack along the meteor path. So, going to go back to this frame. Oh, turn on both layers. Okay, so we need objects in the center of it to crack it, because we can crack it using child vertices, which I find to be the easiest. So let's give it some child vertices. So Shift A, spawn an icosphere, put it in the dead center. Scale along the z-axis so it's really flat, so all the vertices are inside of our previous material. Close enough. Okay, and just imagine me doing this twice because I set up a floor and a ceiling for everything. So to link these as children of this, you want to select the child object first, then the outer parent holding Shift, then press Control P and set parent to. And now if I move the outer object up and down, it tracks the inner object up and down too because it is the child, not vice versa. Now I'll track this, do the same thing, so Shift, Control P. Great, now it has two children. Now we're going to fracture it along its children. So space, self-fracture, child verts, not own particles, noise 45, is what I find works best. You can choose your own. Press OK. I probably should move the menu, but you can see it's fracturing in the background. So it's going to make pretty big pieces because it only has so many children vertices to work with. This is called Voronoi fracturing. It's used in pretty much all modern day special effects whenever they need something to break. Like the movie 2012, where they basically blew up the world, there was a huge amount of this if you read into special effects. This is what it creates. As you can see, it places a whole bunch of dots, slightly randomly, but mostly based on the vertices of the children, and then it just tried to draw lines between all the dots, and that created the polygons. And it's pretty useful. These are actually all now separate objects, and they're actually all wired up physically, but I'll talk about that in a minute. For all, we're going to need a few more polygons to make this look really cool. So Control Z a few times. Come on. Okay, space, self-fracture. Now to do this right, we're going to turn on recursion. Now make it so that these big pieces we created crack into smaller pieces. I mean, most of you are in CS, so you know what recursion is. You want to set the random to 1 so it's not random at all. Every piece cracks. And then you can see in the background it'll create big pieces, and they'll go through each single big piece and break it into smaller pieces. And this is going to take a long time. So I'll just go ahead and show what the result would be. Okay, so this is actually what I used to render, and it's got all of the vertices in place. Actually, they're already fractured. This is what it'll look like once you send a particle through it. And if you look at it through the camera view, it looks pretty cool. Sorry, I kind of got ahead of myself there. Let us go back a few steps. Okay, so I'll just do it without recursion, and you can imagine that there's a lot more pieces than there actually are. Okay, great. Got a single piece here. Space, fracture. Child verts, noise, and go. Okay. Got our floor with cartoonishly big pieces. We're going to go up from Blender Render to Blender Game. This is how we'll simulate. So we shall turn on the layers that we want. Good, the previous floor is turned off. If you have the previous floor that you fractured and the fractures turned on at the same time, the fractures will just fly all over the place. It'll be unusable. If we were to press P to simulate right now, it will just fall. Oh, apparently the scene is upside down. But yeah, so you can see it's falling. So the way I did this, so there are a lot of ways to do this. You can make so objects don't move until they get hit, but that would not work for ceilings. I found it best to turn off gravity and then make the asteroid move so fast that gravity will not have any effect on the scene at all. Okay, so now if we press P, nothing happens. Great. Now I'm going to set up another floor just so we can have like a little bit of an exciting thing going on. Shift D to create a new object, and then you can hold Z to make it go straight up or down. Great, it's lined up with the circle. Now we've got 2 stationary floors. Now we're going to create something to go through them. So Shift A, let's use an icosphere. Move it up a little ways. The easiest way to line this up is to just look through your pathway that you've set up here and place it in the center. Normally it'd be a lot cleaner. I've been kind of rushing. Okay, great. Maybe shrink it down a little bit so that it doesn't collide with the edges. Oh. Okay, and now we have to go make this a physical object. So if I pull it to the side here a bit, you can see if I go to physics, and this is only in Blender Game, then all these have already been set to rigid body, and they've already been given mass relative, or scaled towards their size. So like the smaller pieces have less mass. They get hit around a lot easier. So we're going to turn this from a static to a rigid body, crank the mass up so that nothing will deflect it no matter what. And to make it render a little bit quicker, you want to give it collision bounds that are circular. Where is sphere? There we go. Okay, still nothing happens because we haven't actually made this do anything yet. So we're going to spawn a new screen by clicking in the corner, dragging it up. Has anyone here actually used Blender before? Nice. Yeah, it's kind of a different hotkey scheme. Pretty annoying when you got started today. Yeah. Okay, so you bring up a new screen. You want to go to the logic editor. And this is really the only way you can make a move. In 3D Studio Max, this is as simple as adding an animation. Here you have to go to Add Sensor, Always, then Add Actuator. Actually, no. Yeah, Add Actuator for motion, I think. Edit object. Okay, now we've got our edit object actuator. We change it to dynamics, and then we go to suspend dynamics in dynamic type. So, you know, really complex to do something really simple. Actually, that would make it freeze. We want to keep it dynamic and change the velocity. Not action, but motion. Okay, so it's motion. You go to linear. I just showed you how you keep this ceiling stable, by the way. So you would select the outer rim of the ceiling and set it to stable actuator. Okay, linear. Set the Z speed to 9, this to like 7, and this to 8, if I remember correctly. And that'll make the ball go down and slightly to an angle. So if I press P, yeah, there we go. So as you can see, it collided with the square down there, but because we're using actuators, it just tried to keep on going as hard as it could. So if you can get a good look at that, bang. Now just imagine that there's 2 floors and each of them has like 200 pieces. And that's how we get to the next stage. I'll just show you how to cook this real quick. Oh, so first of all, the ceilings come apart completely. We don't want that. We want the edges to kind of stay together. So to do that, hold Control, circle around the outside, and then circle around the outside again. If there were more pieces, this would work a lot better, but we're going to set these pieces to a special actuator that will keep them from moving. Oh, and now we have a whole bunch of actuators down here. That would be really frustrating to do by hand, so there's a trick to this. Shift A, spawn just any object, set an actuator for it. Kind of makes you miss 3D Studio Max a bit, eh? Edit object, dynamics, suspend dynamics. This will keep it from moving no matter what. Keep it outside the scene. And now we select everything that we want it to apply to. So, you can move things to different layers by selecting the object, pressing M, and then clicking on the layer you want to appear on. Probably should have mentioned that a long time ago. That's how you can set things on the foreground layer or the background layer. It's just really convenient. So Control, circle around. Okay, we've got a handful of pieces that we will make stationary. Now, space, copy. Sorry, I'm completely blanking right now. I forget what you have to copy over. Logic bricks. Copy logic bricks to selected. Okay. Copy. Great. Now all these have suspend dynamics turned on. Or at least the ones we had selected now have suspend dynamics turned on. That means it will not move no matter what. Press P to simulate. Where is the ball? Oh, it's on a different layer. P. Now you can see the edges of the roof do not move. And if we had a lot more edges, this would look a lot better, but we're kind of short for time here. Great. Okay, now we have a ceiling that actually looks pretty nice. Okay. Usually a good idea to do this before you fracture it, but you got a texture that you actually make it look decent. So material, new material. Then go to textures, and these will automatically apply to the material you just created. Go to clouds and change that to image or movie. Find your textures that you wish to use. Ceiling, great. Press Z to make everything actually appear normal. Texture, change the rendering to in the display to GSL from multi-texture, or GLSL. Add an actual light so you can see what's going on. Kind of an involved process. Programs like, well, professional level programs probably have functions to do this automatically, but hey, we have tiles. We should set these coordinates to be global, not generated, so that they stay the same even when the object is spinning around or fractured. Smaller numbers actually make it bigger, counterintuitively. We set it to color, we set it to normal, so we have a bump map thing going on. Great, now we have ceiling. And you would just do this to the material before you fractured it, and or you can just do it to all the materials. So Control to select material, set material to material 1. Actually, subtract. Oh, right, Blender. Okay, definitely do this before you fracture it, otherwise it is impossible to do it all at once. Don't know why Blender has something against that. Anyways, so we've got all of our floors and stuff fractured, and this is what it turns out looking like. With a lot more particles. To actually the transformation turn into keyframes, you would go to render, while you're still in game, you would go to record animation. It'll create a bunch of keyframes. Then to make it so that you only have one active keyframe, if you don't want it animated, because by default it'll have everything flying apart like it would in real life. To keep only one keyframe, select all, press A, spawn a new view down here. And this one we are going, should be a little menu here I can grab onto. Okay. You would set this one to graph editor, I think. Now there's only actually a single keyframe here, but if we want to delete all the keyframes and just leave them in the single position, we'd press A and then delete. And that would make it so they're no longer animated, they're just stationary. And then we can move our camera around separate of everything else, and we have our finished scene. And to render that, you would go back to Blender Render. Make sure your settings are all good. Turn on motion blur. And then hit animation. Well, check with a single normal render first. Animation will go through all the frames one at a time and create your PNGs. And then you can just use something like Microsoft's Windows Movie Maker, which is what I use to put them all into a video and add music or whatever. And yeah, so that's all there is to it. Have a good weekend. Blender takes a long time to render because it is doing raycasting. Oh, any questions, anyone? Kind of late now, but...
Worn out places, worn out faces.